opportunities. But this week, we're taking a look at solar farms, which, according to my next guest, could have a big impact on Britain's farmland. Delighted to be joined by Jason Reed, who's a policy analyst and political commentator. Good to see you. Before we drill down to that on solar panel farms versus wheat and barley and the rest of it, there are reports in not one but two of the newspapers this morning that the Prime Minister may be beginning to have second thoughts on net zero and has even set up a task force within Number 10 to try and find better ways of saving the planet without going to net zero. Do you give that any credibility?
I think there are hints of optimism. The Prime Minister, in a sense, doesn't have a choice at the moment because of the amount of political pressure that's being heaped on him to rethink our energy strategy. Energy bills were heading through the roof anyway. It was going to cause a cost of living crisis anyway. That was before Russia started to invade Ukraine and we started having to rethink our reliance on Russian oil and gas in particular. And so in that context, the net zero goals and the transition to entirely renewable energy sources looks wildly over-optimistic. And so the Prime Minister has to rethink.
Despite us very visibly having hosted COP26 up in Scotland that recently, that celebrated setting these targets, such is the international and domestic pressure that may be a credible rethink.
It didn't take long, did it, after COP26 for all those optimistic targets and all those bold statements that were made to go out of the window, really, because this kind of target is very easy to say 15, 20 years down the line, we'll have switched to renewable energy. But when it comes to actually making that happen, and you're confronted with the real political and economic costs of making that happen, suddenly the politicians realise it's a lot more difficult.
A number of my friends say it's a classic case of the tree huggers running ahead of the real people, because you may want to save the planet and you may want to go for net zero, but when you find that you're going to have to pay 15% more for your petrol on Monday and 50% more for your electricity come April, you're going to say back to the power brokers, get real.
Exactly right. And there are a lot of different ulterior motives at work as well. We've learned recently in the papers this morning as well that some of the environmental groups that campaign against fracking in the past have received money directly or indirectly from the Kremlin, because of course they have a vested interest in keeping us reliant on Russian fossil fuels. And so we have this kind of back to front narrative going on where we've got the government pushing for net zero, but then unable to do what it's actually promised to do.
Yeah. Within the mix, energy supplies are vital, and that, as you rightly and my previous guests rightly said as well, there's clearly a Russian/Ukrainian dimension to that. And it does take time to find different sources of energy, but there are also reports today in the papers that there's going to be a touch on the accelerator, no pun intended, on wind farms being planned, and solar power is spreading across the green and pleasant land of this great country. You've written eloquently mainly about the solar power dimension, but are renewables reliable?
Renewables are, the technology isn't quite there yet. That's the problem. It's easy to see how maybe 20 or 30 years down the line they could form a much, much larger...
We don't have 20, 30 years, do we?
Exactly. This is the problem, is we can't transition as quickly as it's politically necessary, as quickly as the government has promised, but that hasn't stopped thousands and thousands of acres of perfectly usable farmland up and down the country being signed over, in particular to solar farms, but some to wind power as well, in a sort of wild goose chase of chasing this net zero dream that just isn't going to happen. And of course, one other aspect of the consequences of the Ukraine crisis is food production and food security. Food insecurity is a big, big problem in this country that we don't talk about enough. Ukraine and Russia are two of the biggest crop exporters in the world. And so more than ever, we need a strong British farming sector. Meanwhile, we're signing away thousands and thousands of acres worth of perfectly arable farmland to be covered in solar panels so that it can't be farmed anymore. So we're not saving the planet because it won't get us to net zero. But at the same time, we're damaging our food security as well, because where are these solar panels coming from? They're coming from China. Now, China doesn't care about net zero. China uses coal power to produce the solar panels. So we're just funneling money directly into the coffers of the Chinese Communist Party, which uses coal power and which, of course, has plenty of its own human rights abuses and humanitarian disasters going on as well.
Just taking one step back, I'm not denying anything that you've just said there, and all very important points, but one step back into the, as it were, domestic situation, whether it is a field full of solar panels or whether it's stacks and stacks of wind farms. Is this a case of British farmers who really do want to do their best for all of us being made an offer they can't refuse?
I think it's a case of local authorities going a little bit beyond their brief in approving these hundreds of acres at a time per solar farm. Just
Local
signed
Hampshire
away.
County Council, for example, or Dumfriesshire.
Exactly, yes. There's one particular case in Hampshire, in fact, in which I believe it's about 14 football pitches worth of land are about to be signed over, which would make it the largest solar farm in England on agricultural land. And we're just signing away our farmland and in the process signing away our ability to produce our own food, to produce wheat and barley.
Someone who could be in Hampshire could be growing wheat is now growing electricity and pocketing a bob or two for it.
Exactly, and these are the things that we're importing from Ukraine at the moment, or we have done in the past at least, and so we need to be able to produce it here more urgently than ever before.
Jason Reed, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for sharing those thoughts. Food for thought, as it were, or not food.